is inspired, the Republican Party and all its doctrines came as a divine revelation, where farmers were the backbone of the country and the most intelligent people in the world, where all pleasure was sinful and all suffering righteous, where the cities were evil and the country good. His nature drew him back to the books. A banker of Ashtabula introduced him to Henry George's Progress and Poverty, which excited both his imagination and his critical faculties, starting him on the jagged, boundless road toward economic justice. A police judge by the name of Richards gave him a copy of Our Penal Machinery and Its Victims by John P. Altgeld, which turned his mind to thinking about crime in prisons. His intellectual vigor renewed, he again began reading in history and political economy and the verses of the Rubaiyat and hungered for someone with whom to discuss them. He consumed the works of Walt Whitman, who was anathema in Ashtabula, as were the European novelists with whom he felt a kinship of spirit, Flaubert, Turgenev, Zola. He wanted to discuss free trade and free thought, states' rights and single tax, socialism, paganism. He wanted to hear theories built up or torn apart by educated and trained minds. He wanted to meet people who knew the outside world, who could lead him to new books and philosophies, who argued from the premises of logic rather than prejudice. He was slowly, awkwardly, painfully coming of age. As he did so, the son of Emily and Amyras Darrow began to feel the constricted life of Trumbull County confining. If he had been content in Ashtabula, he would have found another house to buy with his $500 down. 7. The Chicago into which Darrow took his wife and son was rough, crude, and vital, the fastest-growing city in America. Even in its early days, said Darrow, Chicago had that wonderful power which clings to it still, that power of inspiring everyone who touches it with absolute confidence in its greatness and strength. It was the nerve center of a vast railroad system which sent thousands of cars daily into every nook of the nation and received them back. Carl Sandburg was to write, 3 overland trains arriving the same hour, one from Memphis and the Cotton Belt, one from Omaha and the Corn Belt, one from Duluth, the lumberjack and iron range. It was the slaughterhouse of America, with the never-ending flow of animal blood. A carload of shorthorns taken off the valleys of Wyoming last week, arriving yesterday, knocked in the head, stripped, quartered, hung in ice boxes today. It was becoming one of the great industrial centers, with its open hearth furnaces roaring by night and day to furnish the young country with resilient fibers of steel, its chimneys belching soft black smoke to become ingrown under eyelids and fingernails. The city is a tool chest opened every day, a time clock punched every morning, a shop door, bunkers, and overalls. 1 million people had crowded into this stretch of prairie at the end of Lake Michigan, the most amazing polyglot of tongues since the Tower of Babel. Polacks, Croats, Serbs, Romanians, Russians, Norwegians, Swedes, Germans, Irish, Sicilians, Greeks, Bulgarians, Finns. And Americans, too, second and third and fourth generation Americans, reaped off the farms and from the hamlets of a dozen neighboring states by the suction of a tumultuous new metropolis in the building. Darrow went into Chicago in a confused state of mind. He wanted intellectual and literary companionship. He wanted the company of intelligent people with whom he might discuss the problems of the modern world. He wanted access to bookstores, to honest newspapers and penetrating magazines. He wanted to see a great city in action, but what he wanted for himself, he did not know. He hoped to do a good job and an important job. In that respect he was ambitious. But his ambition did not include the making of large sums of money. He simply wanted to find his place in the world, do his share of its work, think his share of its thoughts, feel his share of its feelings, know his share of its knowledge. He could not guess into what fields his activities would lead him, nor did he care, except that they be tied up with the interesting and important movements of the day. He installed his family in a modest apartment on the South Side near his brother Everett, was admitted to practice in the state of Illinois, then rented desk space in a law office. Like his father before him, he wore stiff white collars with a black bow tucked in under the wings, a lapelled vest, and heavy dark suits. His face was slowly maturing, though his eyes were still childlike in their candor. Coming from a small town, dressing like a country lawyer, talking in a lazy drawl, almost naive in the open simplicity and sweetness of his manner, He made no impression on the train-shunting, skyscraper-building, hog-killing, steel-blasting city. He knew no one, and in a big city, where one cannot hang out his shingle on a Madison Avenue or a State Street, clients do not stumble into the office of strangers with their legal problems. The weeks passed. Several months passed. The savings dwindled. Darrow became homesick for his friendly Ohio villages and contemplated going back. He started on a new tack. Since clients could not find their way to him, he would find his way to the clients. His first step was to join the Henry George Single Tax Club. After he had attended a few of the weekly meetings and gotten the general tenor of the debates, he ventured to speak. His personality was warm and lovable, his voice low, musical, rich in tonal contrasts, and he did not rise to his feet until he had formulated precisely what he had to say. His combination of logic and good-natured humor helped the group accept his arguments even when he disagreed with certain of their theories. After the meeting, he joined in the informal discussion. Introductions were exchanged, strong hands shaken in hearty, rough, masculine fellowship. And at midnight, the group adjourned to Madame Galli's Italian restaurant for a steak and a bottle of beer, for many pipefuls of tobacco and many mouthfuls of spirited, intelligent talk. He also joined the Sunset Club, whose 100 members formed the rallying point of the literary renaissance in Chicago. Here he was even more at home than at the Henry George Club, where he could not help but be critical of their economic panaceas. In the Sunset Club he could read aloud from Omar Khayyam and Robert Burns, hear lectures by visiting authors, discuss Tolstoy's War and Peace or Dickens's Hard Times, debate the literary values of the realism of L'Assommoir, Germinal, Crime and Punishment, the short stories of Guy de Maupassant, as against the romanticism of Stevenson's Treasure Island, or Daudet's Tartarin of Tarascon. His first lecture before the Sunset Club was on realism in literature and art. Since there are no faster or firmer friendships than those formed between people who love the same books, Darrow was heartily accepted by the writers, teachers, librarians, clergymen, journalists, and professional men who were eager to participate in the robust new cultural movement sweeping the Western world. He had been in Chicago only a few months when he was asked by the Democratic committeemen he had met at the Henry George Club to campaign in the 1888 election. He accepted with alacrity, hopeful that some crumb of what he said might find its way into the newspapers, or that someone in the hall would be impressed and bring him a case the next day. But he always found himself just one of an interminable string of ambitious young lawyers striving to make an impression. His $500 gone, living off Everett's savings, able to find only an occasional real estate abstract to examine, he became increasingly discouraged and sorry he had left his practice in Ashtabula. Then, suddenly but naturally, his opportunity came. The Henry George Club staged a free trade convention in Chicago, which attracted speakers from all over the country, including Henry George himself. Because Darrow had been a faithful worker for the club and was conceded to be one of its best speakers, he was put on the program of the mammoth closing session to be held in the Central Music Hall. Having little law business to distract him, he worked for days on his paper, sound in its economics, constructively critical of the single tax in its weaker links, and written with a lyrical lucidity. The paper finished, he committed it to memory and set out for the meeting. Alas, Henry George was scheduled to speak first. His long, strongly idealistic talk was so good it not only gripped and thrilled the assemblage, but also left them completely satisfied. When the applause died down, the audience rose and began to leave the hall. Darrow begged the chairman to introduce him quickly. His few friends clapped as loudly as they could when he came forward. The departing throng turned its head momentarily in the aisles to see what was going on. Leaning on the years since he was 2 and Mary had taught him to speak pieces, on the years in Kinsman of debating before hostile and indifferent groups, Darrow struck out boldly, thinking hard and fast and clear as he adapted his speech to supplement what Henry George had said, stimulated, as always, by the presence of an audience. People began slipping back into their seats. Soon the aisles were clear, and for the first time in his life, Darrow felt that he had his listeners entrapped in his words and thoughts, that he could move them to any emotion or conviction he willed. When he had finished, he received an ovation. Henry George wrung his hand and assured him that he had a brilliant future. Newspaper reporters crowded about to ask further questions and scribble hurriedly in their notebooks. Friends pounded him on the back. Strangers came up to shake his hand, suggested that they have lunch together, get better acquainted. The next morning, his name and opinions were on the front pages of the Chicago newspapers. His old acquaintances dropped in to congratulate him and use his telephone. But no new business or cases arrived on the flood of publicity. However, in a few days, new friends came into the office to urge him to speak in favor of DeWitt Cregere for mayor. Having learned something of political tactics, Darrow picked his own hall, the best in town, and spoke alone. Newspaper reporters took down what he said, quoted him with moderate accuracy in the morning papers. By this token, Darrow knew that he had arrived, that he was established in Chicago life. Though his first year of practice had brought him only $300 in cash, the prospects for the next year looked good. He moved out of his small apartment and rented a house, the upper floor of which canny Jessie sublet, thus earning back the better part of their rent. 8. During his first year in Chicago, the most important thing to happen to him had been his meeting with another lawyer, John Peter Altgeld, author of the book Our Penal Machinery and Its Victims, which the police judge had handed him in Ashtabula. Note: Darrow's love for Altgeld is revealed in all his writings. End of note. John P. Altgeld had had 10,000 copies printed at his own expense and sent out, inscribed to every legislator, judge, warden, minister, educator, writer, lecturer, social service worker, and club president he could find on a mailing list. He had attempted to show in his book that poverty, slums, and the lack of opportunity, which resulted from the unequal distribution of wealth, lie at the base of the major portion of crime, that the brutal treatment afforded to the merely accused, and later to the imprisoned, was a second crime, committed by society against the individual, whose obsolescent surroundings had been one of the contributing causes of his original criminality. Published in 1884, 5 years before Lombroso's L'Uomo Delinquente, supposedly the first scientific investigation into criminality was released in Italy, this book puts Altgeld in line for the title of Father of Modern Criminology. It was not until 1899, 15 years after the publication of Our Penal Machinery, that Lombroso abandoned his theory that the criminal is a special type, standing midway between the lunatic and the savage, and reached Altgeld's conclusions on the economic base of crime. To Darrow, who had been spending sleepy days defending farmers accused by their neighbors of stealing $15 harnesses, reading this pioneering effort was like being plunged into a cold, clear mountain stream, giving him a clue to the kind of independent thinking being done in the metropolitan world, and quickening his desire to get out of the small farming community. One of his first acts upon reaching Chicago was to go to Altgeld's law office with a copy of Our Penal Machinery and Its Victims under his arm, and tell him what a courageous and penetrating piece of work it was. Altgeld had been so delighted to find his book reaching young lawyers, he had forgotten his restraint in meeting people, his difficulty in making friends, and had welcomed Clarence with warm affection. The two men found they were kindred spirits, and a deep friendship developed. Both had come from small farming communities. Both were plain, down-to-earth, detesting pretension, hypocrisy, and deceit. Both had an intuitively passionate sympathy for the underdog, were gentle-souled, desirous of avoiding discord, yet so intensely stirred by injustice and human suffering, they were willing to endure strife, contumely, and ostracism to fight against them. Both were students, bookish men, intellectuals in the days before it was fashionable to be intellectuals. Both read constantly in Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Dickens, Zola, drawn by the love of these authors for humanity. The 40-year-old Altgeld was the profoundest influence in Darrow's life. He helped educate the younger man, buttressed in him his love of study, of acquiring all the facts, no matter how distasteful they might appear, of clinging steadfastly to the truth, even in the face of such devastating tempests as were nearly to destroy both men before their lives were finished. In return, Darrow was able to bring to the childless Altgeld some of the good things brought to a father by a son: love, filial respect, an eagerness to learn, an hour spent in the warmth of confidence. During his second year in Chicago, Darrow managed to clear expenses by carrying on the general run of minor law business. His evenings he spent at the various clubs and homes of members, debating socialism, discussing modern poetry, formulating plans to help young labor unions to earn recognition. He wrote articles for the liberal and labor press, the most trenchant of which was his attack on the McKinley high tariff bill, for which current topics gave him the lead space and a full-page picture as a frontispiece, thus launching him as a professional journalist. He called the tariff the work of the monopolists and the strong, the narrowest and most reactionary of any law passed by an American Congress. Probably no civilized nation in this century ever so deliberately turned its face to the past, so ignored and derided the growing sentiment of peace and universal brotherhood, which is the hope of all the progressive people and countries of the earth. But mostly, he liked to lecture on literary subjects. He would go to any amount of work to prepare a paper and be happy to give it to as few or as many as cared to listen. A member of one of his early audiences gives an amusing picture of young Darrow on the lecture platform. I first saw Clarence Darrow when he lectured at a Sunday afternoon meeting of the Chicago Single Tax Club in Handel Hall on Randolph Street. He was dressed in a cutaway and had on a white boiled shirt, a low starched collar, and a narrow black bow tie. His subject was Tolstoy's novel Anna Karenina. He was in entire accord with the philosophy of the novel and its sympathy for the oppressed and outcast. Every little while during the address he hunched his wide shoulders forward and ran his hand through the long, straight, stringy, dark brown hair, which fell away from the part on the left side of his head, toward and almost into his right eye, so as to smooth it back. The lecture was full of striking original statements, in simple language, punctuated with shafts of wit and sarcasm, which brought titters and laughter from his audience, but it was apparent he did not utter them to wisecrack. They were relevant to a serious argument, and his face was earnest as he made them. He read a passage from the novel with deep feeling and emotion. This talk made a strong impression on me, and I believe on the audience. Peter Sisman, who was later to save him for the legal profession, after Darrow had barely escaped ending his life in San Quentin Penitentiary, gives the earliest picture of Darrow on the lecture platform. I first met Darrow in February of 1893, when he gave a Sunday night lecture in Jefferson Hall for the Secular Union, a group of Ingersoll freethinkers and rationalists. His subject was Some Fundamental Errors. The charm of his speaking was in his voice and manner and logic. He was analytical and scientific toward socialism. Morally, it was a weakness, that realistic view of his, which made him always doubtful. He could never be carried away by the enthusiasm that the average radical is inspired by. Darrow made a profound impression on his audiences because he had that rare and most beautiful gift, a golden personality. His magnetism leaped out and engulfed people, made them feel warm inside, made them feel good, made them feel happy, made them feel soft and friendly, sympathetic and generous and clear-minded, brought out the best in them. He became one of the leaders of the young and vigorous cultural life in Chicago because he was so gentle and genuine and honest, because his love for books and thinking shone through everything he said, because he had the gift of the bold, striking phrase, the delicious chuckle, because he could dramatize literature and knowledge, bring them to life with tenderness and a wallop. He had passed the point of hoping to find business through this kind of activity. It was self-expression for him and gratified the inherent Darrow love of teaching, of communicating to others the joys he had found. Like a legal Lochinvar, he dashed out to break a lance for every good social cause. He passed the hat at a mass meeting to collect funds for the Boers. He drew an ovation from the Fenians, who were also seeking their freedom from England, when he told them that the men who made the world wiser, better, and holier were ever battling with the laws and customs and institutions of the world. The Chicago Evening Mail started a crusade to compel the streetcar companies to supply seats to passengers. Darrow spoke at mass meetings, chiefly downtown in Central Music Hall, at the corner of State and Randolph Streets. Then, as ever after, an unruly forelock would come down over his brow, caused by the heat and emotions generated in his great dome. He convinced the city that the people were unjustly treated, that something must be done about it. Blue ribbon badges were distributed, inscribed with letters of gold, NSNF at the top and No Seat, No Fare below. Everybody was wearing them, and on a given date, if a fare of 5 cents was accepted, the conductor must furnish a seat. On Der Tag, the traffic was completely upset. Everywhere the police were called to help eject passengers, and many were arrested. It was a short-lived revolution. the company promised more cars at rush hours and a strap for every passenger. 9. He had been in Chicago 2 years when he received a note from Mayor Kregier asking him to call. He promptly ran to the mayor's office, where he was astounded to be offered the position of special assessment attorney for the city. "But, Mr. Mayor, how do you happen to send for me and ask me to be special assessment attorney when you never met me before?" "Don't you know? Why, I heard you make that speech that night with Henry George." Since the salary was $3,000 a year, Darrow accepted the offer and was on the payroll before he stumbled down the steps of the city hall. He trotted all the way to Altgeld's office. "But I haven't sufficient experience in big-town law," he protested, afraid that he had been rash. "I'll see that you get the proper instruction," replied Altgeld with his quiet smile. Darrow did not know it was his friend's recommendation to the mayor that had helped secure his appointment. "A year from now, you'll be laughing at your hesitancy." He was given an office in the city hall with a big desk, a library, a secretary, and a law clerk, and without preliminaries was plunged into work. His duties were to pass on matters of assessments, taxes, condemnations, licenses, to advise city officials who wanted legal justification before they went ahead. Because the city officials wanted opinions right away, right now, without waiting for him to look up the law, Darrow found himself swimming in the middle of a wide, wide ocean. With Altgeld's help, he evolved a modus operandi which was to serve him all his professional life. He thought through a problem on the basis of its facts, then came to the conclusions which he thought to be right, logical, and just. If, upon looking up the matter in the casebooks, he found precedent against him, he did not abandon his stand. "This is the sensible and honest way for such a matter to be decided," he would exclaim. "Somewhere in some law book there must be a precedent to sustain me." And he would continue his search. Nearly always he found a decision that upheld his point of view. 3 months after Darrow had been serving, the assistant corporation counsel of the city got into a party row and was forced to resign. The politicians had found Darrow easily met, accessible, ready to give them the best opinion he could conjure up on a moment's notice, an opinion that had not yet led any of them seriously astray. They liked him, a sentiment he did not always return, so he was promoted to the office of assistant corporation counsel at $5,000 a year. His job was to represent the city in court in all contested cases. Here he acquired his first experience in court procedure, sharpening his knowledge of technique, the relation of the law and the client to the judge and jury. In addition, he was in constant conference with the mayor and aldermen and came to know all the judges. He had held office only 10 months when the corporation counsel became ill. The 33-year-old Darrow was promoted to be corporation counsel of the most tumultuous city in America. One of his assistants writes, "During the period when Mr. Darrow and I were connected with the law department, 2 events occurred which increased its importance. First, the annexation of adjacent municipalities. Second, the preparation for the Columbian Exposition, which was to open in 1893. Here Darrow first crossed swords with 2 of his future opponents, the railroads and Prohibition. The annexation of the villages of Hyde Park and Lake gave rise to many legal complications. For example, whether the absorption of Hyde Park annulled that village's prohibition policy. As to the Columbian Exposition, the interests of the city and the railroads came into sharp conflict. The railroads opposed the city's efforts to open streets across their rights-of-way to offer greater access to the exposition grounds, and efforts were made to block condemnation proceedings and to enjoin the openings of streets. The railroad employed many of the leading lawyers of the Chicago bar, but Darrow won the litigation and the streets were opened. He was honest, he was industrious, and he was clear-headed. Though there was little else to distinguish his tenure of office, these 3 virtues enabled him to carry on his work satisfactorily. He was well-liked and became entrenched in the Chicago legal world. After 4 years of working for the city, the offer had come from the Chicago and Northwestern Railway, inspired in part by the trouncing he had given their leading attorneys of the Chicago bar in the right-of-way litigations. On the advice of Altgeld, against his own inclinations, he had accepted. The months and years had passed quickly enough. He had repaid his debt to Everett, bought a comfortable home for himself and Jessie on the North Side, had continued to read and lecture and debate, making friends with socialists, labor leaders, anarchists, skeptics, freethinkers of all breeds. He remained ambidextrous, serving the railroad with his right hand and the liberals with his left. A few lines appeared in his boyish face. The hair began to disappear at the left temple where he made his part. The eyelids were not open quite so wide in wonder at the world. Life was interesting. He had no conception of what the future held for him. Then, the workers of the Pullman Palace Car Company had struck, the American Railway Union had gone out in sympathy, and an injunction had been issued, for defiance of which Eugene Debs would be thrown into jail. Chapter 2. A Liberal Gets a Liberal Education. The next morning, July 4th, he rose at 6:30, had breakfast with his wife and son Paul, and rode downtown on the streetcar. The business district was holiday deserted. He liked the city in this quiescent mood, without the scurryings of people to confuse it. He checked the satchel he was taking with him to Springfield, where he had been invited to take supper en famille with John Peter Altgeld, who had been elected governor of Illinois 2 years before. This done, he walked toward Lake Michigan, which he could see sparkling and blue through the stubby cavern of Randolph Street, then strolled a couple of blocks south on Michigan Avenue with the sun on his face. Suddenly his attention was caught by the sound of marching feet. In the distance, coming north on the boulevard, he could see troops swinging along, 4 abreast, the guns on their shoulders glistening. As they came closer, he saw they were Federal troops, companies A and C from Fort Sheridan. Then, as he heard the commanding officer bark, "Column right," and watched the soldiers march onto the bare lakefront property next to Convention Hall, where Abraham Lincoln had been nominated for president only 34 years before, break ranks and pitch their tents, he realized they had not been ordered into Chicago for anything so innocent as a 4th of July parade. They had been sent here by the Secretary of War to carry out the injunction against the strikers. They were the enforcing half of what Marvin Hewitt had so neatly termed a Gatling gun on paper. Just the day before, Eugene Debs, president of the American Railway Union, had confided to him, "I do not believe in socialism, but I am forced to the conclusion that government ownership of railroads is decidedly better for the people than railroad ownership of government." Darrow smiled ruefully as there flashed through his mind the symptomatic joke coined by the people of Pennsylvania to satirize their plight. The legislature will now stand adjourned, that is, if the Pennsylvania Railroad has no further business to transact. He had looked up the law. He knew that the order to send troops into Chicago violated the Constitution, which guaranteed states' rights. No divisions of the Federal Army could be sent into a state until the governor of that state had officially asked for them. Not only had Governor Altgeld not asked for military aid, but Mayor Hopkins of Chicago, without whose specific request no state militia could be sent into the city, had made no request of Governor Altgeld for troops. There had been no trouble in Chicago, no hostile gatherings, no violence, no attacks on property, for the American Railway Union had pledged itself to keep the strike peaceful, to protect the Pullman shops and railroad property, and to turn malefactors over to the law. They had kept that pledge faithfully. From May 11th, the day they had gone on strike, 300 strikers had guarded the Pullman shops so constantly that the Pullman executives themselves had never asked for police protection. The Chicago police had patrolled the many miles of railroad track without clashes or disturbances. Superintendent of Police Brennan had reported only the night before that everything remained peaceable. Nor was there the slightest reason to assume that Governor Altgeld would not send state militia when requested to do so by Mayor Hopkins, for he had instantly dispatched regiments to Cairo and other railroad centers when requested by the local authorities. Yet this was the United States Army, organized to defend the country, permitting itself to be cast in the role of strikebreaker. Clarence crossed Michigan Avenue and watched the soldiers make camp. Resting on one leg, following the movements of the uniformed men, some of them husky, sunburned boys, sons of farmers or immigrants, others older men with flowing mustaches, he ruminated on the irony of Federal troops being sent to break a people's strike on Independence Day. It was a bare 118 years since the colonial farmers and merchants, craftsmen and mechanics, laborers and clerks had formed the first American army to rid themselves of the economic and political yoke of the English monarchy. Men had suffered the miseries of starvation, dysentery, fever, and cold, that they might think of themselves as free men, that they might name their own taxes and governors, run their farms and shops and offices, their homes and churches and government. They had torn themselves from their homes and families, died with their own blood strangling them in their throats, that they and their children and their children's children might not be forever strangled by an economic despotism that controlled their lives without giving them a voice or a hearing. Freedom, even so material a concept as economic freedom, had been worth fighting for and dying for. Now they were ruled at home, where they could be ruled more efficiently and comprehensively, where the General Managers Association, an illegal organization, could unlegally use its influence on the Attorney General of the United States to extra-legally appoint the General Managers Association's attorney as Assistant Attorney General in Chicago, and then illegally order that Assistant Attorney General to demand an injunction be issued, no matter how peaceful conditions might be in that city. Two Chicago Federal Circuit Court judges, Grosscup and Woods, would then meet with the newly appointed Assistant Attorney General Walker and assist him in the drawing up of an airtight injunction, with no representative of labor allowed to be present to defend the interests of the workers. To complete the cycle, the United States Army would then illegally be ordered into Chicago to smash the strike. 2. Riding out to gather data in the town of Pullman, where all the trouble had begun, Darrow reflected that George Pullman was the living proof that in America a man needed but one good idea to make millions. When Pullman had been only 20, working in his brother's cabinet shop in upstate New York, he had taken his first overnight ride in a sleeping car. He was given a wooden bunk at one side of a converted coach, where he stretched out fully dressed on a rough mattress and covered himself with his overcoat, for no bedding was provided. Above and below him were other businessmen reclining uneasily in their street clothes. There was dim candlelight, heat was provided by a wood stove on the opposite side of the car, and no fresh air could be had because none of the windows could be opened. The car was noisy and filthy, filled with coal smoke. Sleep was next to impossible. A night on such a car was to be dreaded by even the most stout-hearted, and women rarely entered them. For 20 years these horrendous bunk cars were carried without improvement. For 20 years passengers rode them. Conductors and brakemen passed through them. Railroad officials and managers inspected them, yet no one saw the imperative of making them habitable. Young George Pullman made only one trip in the so-called sleeping car, yet immediately he saw the need for a beautiful and comfortable bedroom on wheels. This son of a mechanic, this trained cabinet maker, was able to formulate overnight and reveal to his closest friend, Ben Field of Albion, his plan for a genuine sleeping car, which was, in effect, the very one now being produced by the Pullman Palace Car Company, toward which Darrow's Illinois Central train was at this moment carrying him. For 4 years, Pullman had continued to work in his brother's cabinet shop, taking occasional contracts, such as the removing of shacks from the bank of the Erie Canal, which was being widened to accommodate heavier traffic. At the age of 24, he had decided he could make his way in a big city. He rejected the close-by New York for the younger and more romantic frontier Chicago, which was growing at the foot of Lake Michigan as fast as the wild onion for which it had been named, and which he saw must ultimately become the railroad center of the continent. Personable, bold, enormously resourceful, George Pullman soon established a solid place for himself in Chicago, taking contracts which had frightened off more seasoned men to raise the level of streets and subsequently of whole blocks of brick and stone buildings which were suffering from a lack of drainage because the city had sprung up haphazardly on low lands behind the sand dunes. In his spare hours, he worked on his plans for the new sleeping car, the dominating passion of his life. In 1858, when Cyrus McCormick completed his reaper factory on the bank of the Chicago River, when the stockyards were beginning to take business away from such porkopolises as Debs's Terre Haute, and Marshall Field was watching his general merchandise mart boom into a department store, Pullman persuaded the Chicago and Alton Railroad to let him try his experiments on 2 of their old coaches. There were no blueprints for the remodeling, Pullman figuring out the measurements and details as he came to them. He hinged the backs of seats so they could be folded down to make a bed, hung the upper berths on pulleys so they could be closed during the daytime and hold the bedding. The cars were upholstered in plush and lighted by oil lamps with a washroom at each end. The brakemen made up the beds. On the first run, the conductor had to compel the passengers to take off their boots before they got into the berths. Though the new sleeping cars were popular with travelers, the railroad companies refused to become excited about them. For his part, Pullman knew that remodeling old coaches was a makeshift, that he would have to build his sleeping cars from the tracks up. The following year, he went to the Colorado mining fields, where he opened a store, spent many hours each day drawing blueprints for the first complete Pullman car. The task took him 4 years. He then returned to Chicago, joined with his friend Ben Field, secured patents on his numerous inventions, and poured his entire working capital of $20,000 into the Pioneer. The car took a year to build and was indeed a pioneer. It was a foot wider and 2.5 feet higher than any car then in service. The beauty and artistry of its furnishings were unprecedented, for Pullman had spent as much to decorate his car as other men spent to furnish their parlors. The Pioneer also gave an immeasurably smoother ride, making sleep possible, for among Pullman's inventions was an improved truck with springs reinforced by blocks of solid rubber. The astounding part of this new car was not only its mechanical ingenuity, which revolutionized car building, but the fact that Pullman, in order to take care of his necessities, had built his car so large that it could not be used on any existing railroad because it was too high to pass under bridges and too wide to be used at station platforms. Pullman, in his strength and daring, had said, "This is what a sleeping car must have. The entire railroad system of America will be changed to fit its needs." Shortly after the car was completed, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated. There was a demand that the Pioneer be attached to the funeral train, which conveyed his body from Chicago to Springfield for burial. The Chicago and Alton Railroad promptly adapted itself to the needs of the Pioneer, and the Pullman Palace Car Company was launched. The Pullman Palace Car helped to contract space and annihilate time. States would be joined more closely together, virgin territories made habitable. Commerce would be quickened, mails and merchandise would be carried more swiftly, the separation of families made sufferable. Businessmen, engineers, builders, teachers, professional practitioners would move about the country, harnessing its resources, opening mines, felling forests, laying out farms, building factories, rearing cities. In the growing power and strength of America, George Pullman had made as outstanding a contribution as Fulton or Whitney. 3. When the train stopped at the 59th Street station, where only a year before it had disgorged crowds to see the World's Fair on the Midway, Darrow took from his pocket a pamphlet he had picked off his desk before leaving home that morning. It was called The Story of Pullman, and had been distributed by the Pullman Company to visitors to the World's Fair. He read, "Imagine a perfectly equipped town of 12,000 inhabitants, built out from one central thought to a beautiful and harmonious whole. A town that is bordered by bright beds of flowers and green velvety stretches of lawn, that is shaded with trees and dotted with parks and pretty water vistas and glimpses of artistic sweeps of landscape gardening. A town where the homes, even to the most modest, are bright and wholesome and filled with pure air and light. A town, in a word, where all that is ugly and discordant and demoralizing is eliminated, and all that inspires to self-respect, to thrift, and to cleanliness of person and of thought is generously provided." When the conductor called out his destination, Darrow descended from the train and struck out for the village that Pullman had created from 500 acres of unused prairie land. He walked down the main street, with its bright red flower beds in the center and rows of tall green trees lining the walks, the houses of neat red brick with trim lawns in front. Why should any workman privileged to live in this utopia want to strike against his benevolent employer? By way of answering his own question, he dropped into the library that Pullman had erected for his workers. A few discreet questions asked of the librarian revealed that the annual dues to borrow the books Mr. Pullman had circumspectly selected for his employees to read were so high that only 250 families out of the 5,000 families living in the town availed themselves of its privileges. Yet, the deserted library was well peopled, compared with the padlocked parsonage alongside of the imposing church edifice, where Darrow stopped next. The parsonage had never known human occupation, because the $65 rent Mr. Pullman asked for the cottage made it unobtainable for any of the Protestant clergymen who had been called to preach in the church. Knocking at random at the doors of several of the red brick houses, Darrow introduced himself as the attorney for the American Railway Union. Some of the men were at the shops, on guard duty. The others talked to him freely, their wives standing behind them, to one side, the youngest child in their arms, the older ones clinging to their skirts. It took only a tour of inspection to convince him that the town of Pullman was a false front designed to impress the casual visitor. The houses were of the cheapest construction, the rooms small and dark and airless, the equipment of the most rudimentary type. Each house had only one faucet, generally in the basement, where it cost the least to bring in pipes, from which water had to be lugged in pails to other parts of the house. In spite of Pullman's protestation that in his town everything that inspires to cleanliness of person is generously provided, there was not one house that had a bathtub. For these dwellings, the Pullman employees paid 25% more rent than had to be paid for similar housing in neighboring communities, but no man could have a job in the Pullman shops unless he rented a Pullman house. The rent was deducted from his check by the Pullman bank before he was handed his wage. If any repairs had to be made to the house before the worker moved in, the Pullman company advanced the money to repair it, and the total sum was taken out of the worker's wages. In the lease which the worker had to sign before he could get his job, there were provisions that he must pay for all repairs, but that he could be evicted upon 2 weeks' notice. Every family Darrow visited told him they had to take in roomers. Realizing that the deeper he penetrated, the closer he would get to hard rock truth, Darrow left the main street and walked into the back part of town, where visitors were never taken. Here he found lawnless tenements with 4 and 5 families crowded into each railroad flat, all the families using one toilet. Again, the rent of $17.50 paid by each family was from 25 to 33% higher than they would have had to pay for single-dwelling accommodations in the neighboring districts, where they could have had privacy, sunlight, a lawn, flowers, and a backyard for their children. Behind the tenements, he found genuine slums, wooden shanties that had cost only $100 to erect, occupied by marginal families who had $8 a month taken out of their wages, a return of from 40 to 50% to the Pullman Company on its investment. Going from family to family, most of whom he found to be second-generation Americans, Darrow became profoundly dejected as he pieced together the story of life in Pullman, where all that is ugly and discordant and demoralizing is eliminated, and all that inspired to self-respect is generously provided. The inhabitants were constantly spied upon, everything they said being reported back to the company. When the men went out of town, their every move was watched. With the first attempt of a man to join a union, he was fired, his family turned out of their home, his name entered on a blacklist and sent to every railroad in the country. Any attempt to discuss, protest, or better any condition brought immediate dismissal. The company gave free medical care to men injured in the shops, but only in return for a liability release signed by the injured workman. If he were misguided enough to bring suit, the company doctor testified against him. All savings had to be deposited in the Pullman Bank. No saloons or resorts were allowed so that the men might enjoy an hour of fun or escape. The workmen complained that even in the sanctity of their own homes, they couldn't go to the toilet without Mr. Pullman knowing about it. George Pullman, proclaiming to the world that he had built a perfectly equipped town, built out from one central thought to a beautiful and harmonious whole, had created for himself a feudal village where he could be the lord and his workmen the serfs, where he could control their every reflex, and where he could take back in rent the better part of the wages he paid them. The families lived under a reign of terror, afraid to trust their neighbors or friends, afraid to think or talk or show their feelings except in the dark, behind shuttered windows and locked doors. 4. But all of this had not caused the strike of May 11, 1894, now almost 2 months old. A depression following the Panic of 1893 had seized the country, and business had fallen off severely. Pullman had found it difficult to secure contracts for his shops to build new passenger or freight cars, and, in order to keep his plant working, had accepted, at an estimated loss of $50,000, building contracts to cover the first few months in 1894. He had then cut wages. When he saw that these cuts were not going to be sufficient to absorb the $50,000 loss that the $36 million Pullman Company would sustain on these contracts, he changed the wage scale from a day wage to a piece wage, at the same time cutting the piece rates to speed up production. By February, expert workmen, who had been with the company for years and who had been earning $3.20 a day, were down to $2.60 a day, then $2.20 a day, than $1.80 and $1.20 a day, and were forced to turn out more work by the piece scale to earn their $1.20 than they had had to turn out to earn their $3.20. By March, skilled mechanics were drawing for 2 weeks' work, after their rent had been deducted, sums ranging from 8 cents to $1, on which they had to feed families of 4 and 5 and 6 for the following 2 weeks. After their meager savings were gone, able-bodied but starved men had to stop work every hour and sit down for a few minutes to gain enough strength to carry on. Conscientious workmen fainted at their machines and were carried out by their fellows. In the homes, the mothers beat their skulls against empty larders to know how to keep little children from becoming ill, developing rickets. Yet George Pullman refused to lower his rents by 1 single penny. "The Pullman Land Company has to earn its 3.5%, he said. "The Pullman Land Company has no connection with the Pullman Palace Car Company, so I can do nothing about rents." When it was pointed out that Mr. Pullman also owned the Pullman Land Company, that his rents had always been 25% above prosperity prices, that these were now Depression times, and that rents in surrounding towns like Kensington had been reduced 20 and 30%, Pullman replied by so distributing work that every inhabitant of a Pullman house was enabled to earn just enough to cover his rent debt to the company, a pattern for starvation so ingeniously contrived that only the mechanical brain of George Pullman could have invented it. There is a starvation level below which not even the most abject laborer will permit his family to sink, for it will do him no good. They will be destroyed in either event. The Pullman employees organized. They sent word to the company to ask if a delegation would be received to present their grievances, and if the company would promise not to discharge their delegates. The company promised. 43 delegates were elected. They told their story to Mr. Wicks, the vice president, after which George Pullman stormed into the room and informed the men that he had nothing to discuss with them. The following morning, all 43 delegates were discharged, their families given dispossess notices. That was when the workers struck. They walked peacefully out of the shops. They sent delegates to Mr. Pullman, asking him to arbitrate. Pullman declared that he had nothing to arbitrate. "The workers have nothing to do with the amount of wages they shall receive. That is solely the business of the company." Mayor Hopkins of Chicago investigated conditions at Pullman and announced his sympathies with the strikers. Jane Addams of Hull House investigated and urged Pullman to meet his workers. The mayors of 56 American cities telegraphed Pullman, urging him to arbitrate. Pullman folded his arms on his chest and stood like a colossus above his shops and his village and his workers, a medieval king who ruled by divine right and whose omnipotent will was not to be questioned. It was, thought Darrow, walking to the train with the background material he needed for the preparation of this case, an almost unparalleled instance of brutal greed and callousness. From the train window, he watched the model town of Pullman until it disappeared from sight. In building that town, George Pullman had had one of the greatest opportunities of the modern age. The hopeful eyes of the world had been upon him, waiting to see if, with his magnificent talent, foresight, and courage, he was going to create the beginnings of a new social order, help build a stronger and wiser breed of man, generations of skilled craftsmen who would live vigorously and well, who would work in loyal and intelligent cooperation, whose families would grow up strong of body and alert of mind, educated, independent, robust citizens of an industrial democracy which would become ever richer and stronger in its arts and crafts and sciences and humanities. If Pullman had been as far-sighted, courageous, and resourceful in building his town as he had been in building the Pioneer, he would have been revered as one of the greatest pioneers of the ages, the designer not merely of a railroad car and a railroad system, but of a humane civilization. Sitting in his train seat with his eyes closed, the powerful sun beating through the window pane onto his face, Darrow speculated on why it was that America was bringing forth the greatest mechanical geniuses in history. Was it the historical imperatives that had developed them? Then why had not those historical imperatives brought forth men of equal talent and fortitude to invent social machines, to erect a human society which would be the equivalent in its workings to the superb mechanical structure? Why was it that the mechanical and executive geniuses of the times were rarely interested in the welfare of humanity? Did interest in the machine preclude interest in people? Did the mind come to consider the machine as the ultimate goal, with mankind serving only as a tool? Why had America developed so few men whose rich, resourceful, and inventive minds conceived of the machine as the liberator of all men, rather than the producer of wealth for the initiate? Was it too soon yet? Darrow asked himself. Had we of necessity to create our industrial machine first, before we could turn our peculiarly inverted gifts to using that machine for the benefit of the people who manned it? 5. He picked up his valise and walked quickly to the Chicago and Alton station, where he bought half a dozen Chicago and Eastern newspapers before boarding the train. In several of them were pictures of George Pullman, his hands stretched out in front of his chest in clerical gesture, all 5 fingertips touching. Under the photographs were encomiums of the patriot and benefactor who was being attacked and undermined by the striking anarchists. Within the same pages were cartoons of Governor Altgeld, standing on the supine bodies of President Cleveland and the Democratic donkey, an incendiary torch in one hand, the flag of anarchy in the other. Altgeld, the fomenter of lawlessness, the apologist for murder, the encourager of anarchy, rapine, and the overthrow of civilization, the lunatic, the mysterious fragment of jetsam from Lord knows where, an alien by birth, temperament, and sympathies, who has not one drop of true American blood in his veins. Darrow had pronounced publicly when Altgeld had been elected a Superior Court judge, "What ought to be done now is to take a man like Judge Altgeld, first elect him mayor of Chicago, then governor of Illinois." He had been laughed at for his gratuitous counsel, yet John Peter Altgeld, one of the least attractive-looking men in public life, if I had to depend on my looks, I'd have been hung long ago. With a hare lip, an impediment of speech, coarse hair that grew forward on his skull like a mat, with heavy features and a thick torso on stubby legs, the man who had risen from the most abject poverty, from the enslavement of a brutish peasant father, who had been badly fed, badly clothed, worked into exhaustion as a child, who was without formal education, who had been despised and ridiculed by his playmates, and had endured the humiliations and sufferings of the underdog, had fulfilled Darrow's rash prediction and become the first Democratic governor of the state of Illinois. Altgeld was uncommunicative about his background, but he had told the story to his friend Clarence. Brought from Germany at the age of 3 months, he had had to flee his unsympathetic home in Ohio to escape his father, who had insisted that he stay away from books and study and work on the land from dawn to dark. The young boy had wandered on the road like a derelict, working now as a farmhand, now as a section hand on the Mississippi, Kansas, and Texas Railroad, now as a laborer in a chemical plant in St. Louis, half the time without work, hungry, destitute, cold, friendless, ill, without hope. Yet within him had flamed a resolve not to remain homeless and despised, ignorant, and unwanted. Through his hunger to learn, he had read enough to qualify as a rural schoolteacher, then a rural lawyer, at length making his way to Chicago, the dream and hope of the Middle West. In Chicago there had been years of grubbing, making a friend here, a dollar there, but always impressing people by his honesty and thoroughness. Finally, he managed to save $500, which he invested in real estate in outlying parts of Chicago, subdividing and building with such an accurate eye for the growth of the city that within a few years he was handling single deals amounting to $200,000 and was on his way to becoming a millionaire. He had been elected by the working people of Illinois because he had worked for their rights and protection in the form of industrial legislation. Altgeld believed in capitalism, not the kind that Pullman practiced, but the kind which would bring to actuality the promise of industrial democracy implicit in the line of the Declaration of Independence, which says that every man is entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Pullman, in refusing to recognize or deal with a union, said, "We deal with our men individually as a corporation, and we expect them to deal with us individually as workmen." Altgeld felt that if it had been true politically for the 13 colonies that in union there is strength, and that union had made it possible for the colonies to turn themselves into an independent nation, then it was also true economically for the tens of millions of workers that in union there is strength, and the more their union brought them strength, the more would it strengthen the nation. At dusk the train reached Springfield, and Darrow walked briskly to the imposing brick edifice that had been built in 1854 to serve as the governor's mansion. Mrs. Altgeld, who was a lovely and sedate woman, came herself to open the door for Clarence, bid him a warm welcome, and led him upstairs to the governor. From the open door of the library he had time to observe that the older man's face was drawn and tense as he wrote hurriedly at his desk, his full-bearded face framed against low shelves of leather-bound books. Clarence walked across the heavily rugged room. Altgeld looked up disturbedly, then relaxed, rose, and gripped his hand. "Well, Clarence, I hear you resigned from your job with the Chicago and Northwestern to defend Debs. I trust it isn't misguided idealism, son. There's little but grief in this martyr business." Darrow's blue eyes twinkled slightly as he thought, "No one knows that better than you." Aloud he answered, "You know, Governor, most men do things through a desire to escape pain. Did you ever stop and watch a blind man begging on a street corner? A man passes by hurriedly and suddenly stops still. He looks hurt, annoyed. He goes back and drops a coin in the blind man's cup. Well, maybe he couldn't afford the dime. But the sight of the helpless man standing forlornly at a corner hurts him, makes him feel a sense of social responsibility, and so he buys 10 cents worth of relief from social pain. It hurts me too much to see Debs and men like him faced with the possibility of spending years in prison, so I am buying relief too." Altgeld smiled, put his hand on Darrow's shoulder for an instant, then returned wearily to his desk, waving Darrow to a nearby chair. Darrow hitched up close. "I watched federal troops pitch camp in Chicago this morning." "Yes," replied Altgeld. "I'm just drawing up my protest to President Cleveland. Right this very moment I have stationed in Chicago 3 regiments of infantry, 1 battery, and 1 troop of cavalry, but neither Mayor Hopkins nor the superintendent of police nor the sheriff of Cook County has felt there was any need for them. In the light of these facts, how can the United States Army move in?" "It's pure railroad politics. The railroads make it appear that you refuse to protect private property, then have Attorney General Olney misrepresent to President Cleveland and get the federal troops in here. That gets you out of the way, and they have complete control." "There's more to it than that, son. By remaining peaceful, by merely refusing to move trains carrying Pullmans, the strikers are on their way to victory. Their demands are just, and the public is with them. The only thing that can defeat the strike now is violence. The railroads know that by bringing federal troops in here, they can outrage the workers and start them fighting. If the fights don't start spontaneously, the railroads will start them. As soon as 1 soldier is killed or 1 train wrecked, the strikers will be defeated, no matter who is responsible, for the newspapers will blame it on the workers, and the people of the country will turn against them. Even now the press is carrying on a vitriolic campaign to convince the country that anarchy prevails in Chicago, that the strike is a revolution, and that the issue is not the Pullman workers' wage question, but a contest between law and order on one hand and lawlessness and anarchy on the other." Darrow nodded his head. "This day has been heavily interlarded with ironies for me, Governor, but coming up on the train I was struck by the most profound irony of them all. Our independent American press, with its untrammeled freedom to twist and misrepresent the news, is one of the barriers in the way of the American people achieving their freedom. Yes, but we have to keep them free to misrepresent now, in the hopes that one day they will use that freedom to tell the truth for the whole people." He picked up the sheets on which he had been writing, carried them to the north window, and stood reading in the failing light, his lips moving silently as his mind rehearsed the sentences. Mrs. Altgeld came in to tell them that supper was ready. Seeing her husband silhouetted against the window, his expression somber and harassed, she crossed to him, slipped an arm gently through his. "Clarence," asked Altgeld, "would you perhaps like to hear the protest I am sending to President Cleveland? Waiving all questions of courtesy, I will say that the state of Illinois is able to take care of itself. Our military force is ample, and consists of as good soldiers as can be found anywhere in the country. They have been ordered promptly whenever and wherever they were needed. So far as I have been advised, the local officials have been able to handle the situation, but if any assistance were needed, the state stood ready to furnish 100 men for every 1 man required, and stood ready to do so at a moment's notice. In 2 instances, the United States Marshal applied for assistance of the state to enable him to enforce the processes of the United States Court, and troops were promptly furnished him. To ignore a local government in matters of this kind, when the local government is ready to furnish the assistance needed and is amply able to enforce the law, not only insults the people of this state by imputing to them an inability to govern themselves, but is a violation of a basic principle of our institutions. I ask the immediate withdrawal of the federal troops from active duty in the state." Darrow took the paper from the governor's hand and scanned it quickly. "If Cleveland has any regard for the laws under which he is supposed to rule—" Altgeld shook his head sadly. He won't withdraw the troops. The Eastern papers are screaming that a state of insurrection exists in Chicago. Olney is showing him frantic telegrams from Edwin Walker crying for more troops to quell the riots. Clarence, if you want to get a clear picture of what will happen to you if you defend labor leaders and fight for social justice, just watch the flood of invective that will be poured on my head in tomorrow's papers for protesting this clear and inexcusable violation of the Constitution. It's their final insult because I pardoned the anarchists. They want to repudiate me as a Democrat, so the Republicans won't have the chance to say to the country, "We told you the Democrats are radicals, that they favor anarchy and the destruction of property." As Darrow bade him goodbye to catch the midnight train back to Chicago, Governor Altgeld murmured, "Watch developments closely and keep me informed. We are partners now, son, and there are going to be bad days ahead for both of us." 6. The next morning, Darrow alighted, cramped and stiff, from the coach in which he had sat up all night, had breakfast, and rode a streetcar into South Chicago. When he reached the point where the tracks of the Illinois Central and the Rock Island, the two lines at the center of the trouble, paralleled each other, he found the tracks heavily guarded by men with revolver holsters strapped about their waists, 3,600 of them having been sworn in as deputy marshals. Rich men would not do the rough work of deputies for a few dollars a day. Professional men were too busy to serve. Men with jobs could not give up those jobs for a few days of work. Unemployed workers did not take police jobs against their fellows. Who then was left? Walking among the newly sworn deputies, stopping here to share a cigarette and there for a chat, he saw that they had been recruited from the dregs of the Chicago Tenderloin, swollen by the influx of adventurers to the World's Fair the year before, gangsters, hoodlums, toughs, petty criminals, sharpers, loafers, dope addicts, alcoholics. These were the men who now wore the badge of the United States government, who were going to enforce law and order, defend society against the revolutionary strikers. The headlines of the newspapers that had alleged Chicago to be in control of incendiary anarchists had indeed come true. These deputized representatives of the federal government, armed and paid for by the railroads, fitted neatly into what the terrorized public had been bludgeoned into believing the anarchists were, miscreants who had nothing to lose, who would burn and destroy a city for the pleasure and pillage involved. By mid-morning, he had made his way to the stockyards. He halted abruptly as he saw United States soldiers attempting to move a cattle train out of the yard, astounded at the boldness of the General Managers Association in committing this most obvious illegality of them all. Federal troops had been sent into Chicago by President Cleveland to protect property, and here they were acting as strikebreakers. The assembled workers and their sympathizers, as had been expected, were not liking this idea. Each time the soldiers tried to move the train, the track ahead was blocked by the overturning of empty freight cars and the spiking of switches. Darrow watched the contest all day. By nightfall, the Army had been able to move the train 6 blocks. Learning that the General Managers Association was determined to prove they could bring a Pullman train into Chicago over the Rock Island Road, early the following morning Clarence hurried south to 51st Street. A through train was coming slowly down the track, United States soldiers stationed on its cowcatcher. A protesting crowd collected, the engine slowed, the soldiers jumped down, charged into the men, and dispersed them. There was jeering, a few stones were thrown. When the train reached 40th Street, it was blockaded by overturned freight cars. Only through the combined efforts of Mayor Hopkins, Superintendent of Police Brennan, and a railroad superintendent with a crack crew, which righted the freight cars, was the Pullman able to move the next 30 blocks by the end of the day. The railroads were paralyzed. Foodstuffs and machinery could be moved neither in nor out of the city. The workers had won. Nevertheless, the overturning of the strike was implicit in the overturning of the cars, for contrary to the orders of Eugene Debs, the first railroad property had been manhandled. That night, violence broke loose. Standing above the yards, Darrow watched a number of freight cars, and the strike with them, burst into flame and vanish in smoke. The next morning, the newspapers of the country informed their readers that Chicago was in a state of insurrection. The railroads demanded further protection. Mayor Hopkins wired Governor Altgeld, who promptly provided 6 companies of state militia. Human blood once again flowed in the streets of Chicago, the slaughterhouse of the nation. The police spent a considerable portion of their efforts restraining the newly appointed United States railroad deputies from slugging and shooting into the crowds, arresting numbers of them for drunkenness and thievery. Mayor Hopkins, fearing that the railroads might sue the city to collect damages on the grounds of inadequate protection to property, gathered 40 depositions to prove that agents of the railroad companies had set fire to the cars. By afternoon, huge crowds collected along the tracks and in the yards, some few hot-headed strikers who could not be restrained by Debs's orders, thousands of sympathizers, the interested and the curious, the wild boys, the foreign-speaking population which inhabited those sections, and the entire underworld of Chicago came out to watch the sport, to enjoy the excitement, to see what they could get out of it. They milled about, the excitement rose, angry names were called, fists flew. At 3:30 in the afternoon they charged into the police and militiamen who were trying to disperse them. The soldiers fired.